Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Father Gregory Mohrmann. I'm the headmaster of the St. Louis Priory School, and I've been asked to moderate this afternoon's panel. I'd like to begin with a quote from Pope Francis. He says this: "Dialogue is born from an attitude of respect for other persons, from a conviction that the other person has something good to say. It assumes that there is room in the heart for the person's point of view, opinion, and proposal. To dialogue entails a cordial reception, not a prior condemnation. In order to dialogue, it is necessary to know how to lower the defenses, open the doors of the house, and offer human warmth." End quote. Pope Francis spoke these words to the bishops of Buenos Aires. Indeed, his commitment to interfaith dialogue has been noted for many years, long before his elevation to the papacy. Shortly after his election, Pope Francis said that his title of pontiff means literally a builder of bridges, and that is what his intention to build bridges connecting all people in such a way that everyone can see in the other not an enemy, not a rival, but a brother or sister to be welcomed and embraced. And so we today would like to delve more deeply into the promises, the successes, the failures, and the importance of Pope Francis's commitment to interfaith dialogue. And we seek to understand what dialogue with the Catholic Church truly hopes to achieve. To help us in this pursuit, we have with us today three guests: Dr. Ali Banuazizi, Rabbi Wayne Franklin, and Dr. Timothy Sherratt. From an Islamic perspective, Ali Banuazizi is the director of the program in Islamic Civilization and Societies and chair of the International Studies Academic Advisory Board at Boston College. He is currently an editor of the Encyclopedia of Islam and the Muslim World. From a Jewish perspective, Rabbi Wayne Franklin is senior rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Providence, Rhode Island. He currently serves as the secretary and treasurer of the National Council of Synagogues, a multi-denominational Jewish group which engages in interfaith dialogue with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the National Council of Churches. He has been a leader in various interfaith endeavors, including the Rabbis and Priests Dialogue and the Abrahamic Accord. And from a Protestant perspective, Timothy Sherratt teaches American politics, constitutional law, and public policy at Gordon College in Massachusetts. He serves as a columnist for the Center for Public Justice's Capital Commentary series, and his book, Power Made Perfect: Is There a Christian Politics for the 21st Century?, will be published in 2016 by Cascade Books with and stock. We will start the panel with Dr. Banuazizi.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted, inspired, and honored to have been asked to serve on this panel. I should start perhaps with a disclaimer that I'm not a theologian, and therefore my comments will probably be more an attempt to put the dialogue between Christians and Muslims in some sort of historical and contemporary context. My involvement and commitment to Islam is as a student of Islamic history and tradition and culture. And as far as my familiarity with Catholicism, all I can say is that I have taught for the past over 4 decades at a Jesuit Catholic. We're not supposed to discuss the difference between the two or the relationship between the two. For the past 44 years at Boston College. The interreligious dialogue in the modern sense of the term between Catholics and Muslims has a rather short history. For all intents and purposes, it can be traced back to the mid-1960s and the Second Vatican Council. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I believe that there certainly must have been many other attempts over the past centuries. The one that I would like to mention as a truly inspiring example of searching for such a dialogue is attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, who with his profound spiritual commitment to all things living, to the poor and to peacemaking, actually navigated the difficult path between the church and at the time what was called, or what later came to be known as the Fifth Crusade in 1209. He traveled to Egypt, and there on the banks of the Nile, in the town of Damietta, on the eve of the attack of the Christian soldiers, he sought to persuade them not to do so. Then he asked for an audience with the Muslim king or sultan, and he was granted his wish, and the king brought out his top advisor, religious advisor, and had St. Francis debate him. And they found much in common because the top religious advisor of the king happened to be a Sufi mystic who probably found much in common with the thinking and tradition and the spirit of St. Francis Assisi. St. Francis was unable to stop the attack, the laying of siege to the city. They went ahead. He returned and was profoundly affected by this experience, got very depressed, and for the rest of his life he devoted much of his endeavors to the promotion of better understanding of the other. Now, I mention this encounter not only because of its inspiring quest of a saint for peace and reconciliation, but to point to the fact that the basis of the relationship between the Muslim world and the Christian world until then, and perhaps somewhat later than that date, was on the basis of religion. From the Muslims' point of view, the West was equated with Christianity. And for most Christians who were not really terribly familiar with other Oriental religions during this period and earlier on, the East was primarily Islam and the world of Muslims. Now, this changed, however, over the next several centuries, and the foundations or the avenues for the relationship, the linkages, if you will, between the West, Christian world, and the Islamic world were now based on things other than religion, on commerce, on the quest for power and domination, for colonialism as we move to the 18th and 19th century, Napoleon going to Egypt, and then the entire colonial experience. Now, that period, which had little to do with religion, came to shape many of the reactions of the Muslims, and particularly when we get to the 19th century, we see that religion now comes again into play, but as a way of standing up to the West as a way of pushing back, as a way of relying on what they considered to be their sense of authentic religious, cultural identity. So if you will, religion began to be, to use a modern way of talking about it, politicized. Islam came to be politicized during this period. And this is a heritage that we carry even until our own times. Now, to say a few words about these early attempts to connect Christianity to Islam through a dialogue. As I mentioned, a first formal beginning could be described, or could be said to have been 1964, when towards the end of the Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, there was an attempt to establish actually a secretariat for non-Christian religions and to try to promote dialogue. Pope Paul II, during his papacy from 1978 to 2005, made a concerted effort through extensive travels throughout the world, and in a 1985 speech delivered in Casablanca, Pope John Paul II said, "We believe in the same God," speaking now to Muslims and other believers, that we believe in the same God as the one that you do, as one God, the living God who created the world, in a world which desires unity and peace, but experiences 1,000 tensions and conflicts. So he goes on. And then he says, too often in the past we have opposed each other in polemical wars and in actual wars. I believe that today God invites us to change our old practices. We must respect each other and we must stimulate each other to do good works on the path to rightfulness. 4 years later, John Paul reorganized the Secretariat for Non-Christian Relations and renamed it as the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. And Pope Benedict, in spite of that unfortunate quote from another scholar, he in fact was himself committed after that episode and spoke of the need for such a dialogue. He said on one occasion that interreligious and intercultural dialogue between Christians and Muslims cannot be reduced to an optional extra. It is in fact a vital necessity on which in large measure our future depends. Now, as I think all of us know who follow the words and actions of Pope Francis, he probably more than any other pope so early in his papacy has attempted to make these bridges through travels, through speaking at various gatherings, starting as I was looking through these accounts in Sri Lanka, where he gave a most eloquent and passionate sermon, then going to Turkey, to Sarajevo, and on each occasion he has emphasized the need for such dialogue. I believe all of that is quite familiar to all of you, so I can skip a few quotes, wonderful quotes that I had from him. Now, on the other side, on the Muslim side, surely there have been attempts to respond to the reach to the extended hand of the Catholic hierarchy and other well-intentioned Christians throughout this period. One can think, for example, that back in 2007, a very prominent group of Muslims began an endeavor called the Common Word between us and you, an initiative that has since expanded into various other Christian denominations and has become an avenue for interfaith dialogue between Christians and Muslims. There have been many, many such attempts. But then there are also serious problems on the Muslim side. This is an extraordinary period in Islamic history. Whatever characterization that we have of Islam should always be thought about, should always be talked about with the question, has Islam always been like this? Or is this a particular phase that we are going through in the Muslim world? As I mentioned, the beginnings of this ideologization of religion can be dated back to the 19th century. But this has continued. This struggle, initially against the arrogant powers of the West, but later directed against the leaders, the monarchs, the kings, the arbitrary rule in the Muslim world, who were, for better or worse reasons, associated and oftentimes received support from the West, has led to many attempts to use religion as an ideological weapon to attack, that is, rhetorically attack, ideologically attack other Muslims, other leaders, and oftentimes the West itself. Now, we also know of all forms of extremism in the Muslim world, which does not respond in any realistic way to attempts at reconciliation and dialogue. We're well aware of that, and I think anyone who is interested in promoting such a dialogue must be aware of that. We also know that quite aside from the politicization of religion, yet another phenomenon has been taking place in the Muslim world, and that is what I might call the sacralization of politics. That is, groups that begin with a clear political agenda, in fact a territorial state, and then attempt to sacralize those claims or those possessions by bringing religion as a tool, as a way of justifying these attempts. So all of this is going on. On top of it, we have, of course, the gulf between the two branches of Islam, this kind of interfaith, or not interfaith, I should say, the enmity between the two branches of Islam, Sunnism and Shiism, which again is being exploited for political and strategic purposes. So there are all these things going on in the Muslim world which make the dialogue very difficult. On top of it all, of course, we have the phenomenon, perhaps to some degree justifiable, of Islamophobia, which oftentimes becomes quite provocative to Muslims and makes any kind of reconciliation approach even more difficult. So, in short, we are at a particular moment in the history of this dialogue where the other side of the dialogue, the Muslim side of the dialogue, is having a terribly, terribly difficult time putting in its own house in order. And it has yet another disadvantage in that, unlike the Catholic Church, there is no one who can speak for Islam with any degree of authority for the entire Muslim world. There is no equivalent of the church, the mosque, if you will, that could exercise such an authority or impose, if you will, such an order. So these are the difficulties. I hope that in the discussion we can address some of these issues more concretely. But I want to go back to that inspiring example of Saint Francis. Remember that those two were very difficult times. There had already been 4 previous crusades, and in spite of all of that, in spite of the fact that the Pope at the time was giving support to the crusades, St. Francis stood up and spoke out from his deep faith, as I mentioned, in all things, living in the poor, in the fundamental need for understanding and reconciliation with the other. So his task was not much easier, neither is ours.
Thank you, Doctor. Rabbi Franklin.
Let's try this. I'm also very pleased and honored to be here with you. It's a wonderful audience, and it's delightful to see adults taking such time as you're doing to engage in learning and serious thinking. When the Bible introduces us to Noah, it identifies him as a righteous man in his generation. The Hebrew text declares, Ela toldot Noach, Noach ish tzadik, tamim haya b'dorotav. Means these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation. Now, when the rabbis consider this verse, they focus their attention on the last word, b'dorotav, in his generation. And they wondered, was Noah really a righteous man like our patriarch Abraham, who would have been recognized as a righteous man at any time? Or did he appear righteous only in comparison to the wicked people in his own generation? I'd like to use this rabbinic parallel in reflecting on the young papacy of Pope Francis. I believe that in the eyes of most Jews today, Pope Francis is regarded as a righteous pope, not only in comparison to most of his predecessors, whose attitudes towards Jews and Judaism were often problematic, but even in comparison to the most recent popes, who have dramatically changed the way the Church views Jews and Judaism for the better. Pope Francis, I believe, appears very favorably in Jewish eyes, even when compared to such great men as Popes John the 23rd, Paul VI, Benedict XVI, and St. John Paul II. It's noteworthy that on the very day of his election to the papacy, Pope Francis initiated a warm exchange with Rabbi Riccardo de Segni, the chief rabbi of Rome. At his inauguration a few days later, in his inaugural homily on March 19, 2013, the Pope singled out the Jewish leaders in attendance as he welcomed the representatives of the Jewish community and the other religious communities. Clearly, Pope Francis is building on the important work of these recent church leaders, but he starts in a different place from his predecessors. As a church leader in Argentina, Cardinal Bergoglio demonstrated his support for and his solidarity with the Jewish community when terrorists bombed and murdered 85 people at the Amia Jewish Center in Buenos Aires in July 1994. In 2005, Cardinal Bergoglio was the first public personality to sign a petition calling for justice in the Amia bombing case. Nothing had been done. He was one of the signatories on a document called 85 Victims, 85 Signatures. part of the bombing's 11th anniversary. He also led the Argentinian church in Holocaust commemoration and education. A few weeks ago, I attended a conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the promulgation of Nostra Aetate at the Catholic University in Washington. A lot of talk about how important the document was, and it was followed by other documents. And in a 1969 document titled Reflections and Suggestions for the Application of the Directives of Nostra Aetate, a working document prepared for the Holy See's Office for Catholic-Jewish Relations, a passage declares, relations between Christians and Jews have for the most part been no more than a monologue. A true dialogue must now be established. Pope Francis has been a partner in that dialogue. Starting in December 2010, he and his friend Rabbi Abraham Skorka shared a TV dialogue program on the Buenos Aires Archdiocesan Channel 21. The program was coordinated by an evangelical Protestant, Marcelo Figueroa, also a friend of Bergoglio. That same year, the Cardinal and the Rabbi published selections from those dialogues in what became the Pope's first book, On Heaven and Earth. It's been translated into English and is available. If you've not seen it, you may find it interesting. As for Cardinal Bergoglio, he didn't just advocate adhering to this teaching of the Church, encouraging dialogue. He lived it through his ministry in a very public way. When he ascended to the papacy, Pope Francis invited his friend Rabbi Skorka to spend several days with him at the Vatican. Rabbi Skorka's days at the Vatican fell on the Jewish holy days of Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, which are the concluding days of the fall festival of Sukkot, the harvest festival. These are, in effect, the conclusion days of a month-long celebration of New Year festivities. These festive days, these 2 days, were followed immediately by the Shabbat, Sabbath. And one doesn't travel if one is an observant Jew on such days, and one's activities are limited towards a more restful environment. Rabbi Skorka described his experience at the Vatican. He said, I eat with him at breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. He cares for me and controls everything regarding my food to make sure it is all kosher and according to my religious tradition. These are festive days, and I have to say certain prayers at meals, and I expand the last prayer and translate it. He accompanies me, together with the others at his table, his secretaries and a bishop, and they all say Amen at the end. To say that such a warm, respectful, and affirmative reception of a pope is unprecedented is truly an understatement. What about the Pope's statements? The Pope has made no secret of his belief that Christianity has its roots in Judaism. He told an interviewer that inside every Christian is a Jew. A year ago in Spain's La Stampa Vanguardia newspaper, he spoke about dialogue with Jews. He said, I believe that interreligious dialogue must investigate the Jewish roots of Christianity and the Christian flowering of Judaism. I understand that it's a challenge, a hot potato, but it is possible to live as brothers. When the Pope speaks of the Christian flowering of Judaism, I don't regard his words as suggesting supersessionism, which used to be an attitude of the Church. I regard it as his way of saying that Christianity grew from its Jewish roots. And I wholeheartedly share his belief that it is possible to live together as brothers. Pope Francis has reiterated this theme on other occasions. In an interview with the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot, he declared, anti-Semitism is a sin. Our roots are in Judaism. On June 24th, 2013, he addressed a delegation of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultation, which is a widely recognized Jewish group dealing with other world religious bodies. He said to the group, due to our common roots, a Christian cannot be anti-Semitic. Furthermore, in a letter to Eugenio Scalfari, a self-described non-believer who edited the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, Pope Francis wrote the following: with the help of God, especially since the Second Vatican Council, we have rediscovered that the Jewish people remain for us the holy root from which Jesus was born. As my mind turned to the terrible experience of the Shoah, the Holocaust, I looked to God. What I can tell you with St. Paul is that God has never neglected his faithfulness to the covenant with Israel, and that through the awful trials of the last century, the Jews have preserved their faith in God. And for this, we, the Church, and the whole human family can never be sufficiently grateful to them. I must tell you, we Jews have never heard sentiments like these from a pope. Pope Francis has also demonstrated a significantly positive relationship with the State of Israel. When the Pontiff visited Israel, he visited the Western Wall and Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem, I'm sure you know, is Israel's museum and monument to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. Pope Francis followed in the footsteps of his noble predecessors John Paul II and Benedict XVI in making these visits. But Francis went a significant step further. He visited the grave of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, which blossomed in the birth of the State of Israel. This dramatic gesture has deep resonance for Jews, and here's why. In January 1904, in a private audience, Herzl appealed to Pope Pius X for support in his quest to gain a territory upon which Jews could establish their own nation. Herzl recorded Pius X's response in his diary. Pius said, "We cannot give approval to this movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it. The soil of Jerusalem, if it was not already sacred, has been sanctified by the life of Jesus Christ. As head of the Church, I cannot tell you anything different. The Jews have not recognized our Lord. Therefore, we cannot recognize the Jewish people." In contrast to such earlier attitudes, Francis is honoring the memory of Herzl, along with his endorsement of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, resounds as an affirmation of the right of the Jewish people to our own homeland. By then inviting former Israeli President Shimon Peres and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to join him in prayer at the Vatican, Francis was inserting himself as a peacemaker who seeks, among other goals, to secure the State of Israel for future generations of Jews. Not all Jews evaluate his actions and statements as I do, because any openness to Palestinians is regarded by them as a threat to Israel. I don't agree with them. Whether he will be successful in the Middle East, as he seems to have been in bringing the U.S. and Cuba to a better relationship, only time will tell. But of this I am confident. The Jewish people have a friend in the Vatican like no one before him. In his righteousness, he stands out like Abraham in his generation, a man who is considered righteous even among the righteous. Francis's papacy is yet young, but already he has taken huge strides forward in Catholic-Jewish relations. With Pope Francis's genuinely warm, open heart, I anticipate that we will see further elaboration of the meaning of Nostra Aetate, not only this year during the 50th anniversary, but far into the future. We wish him good health and long life. Thank you.
I would also like to begin, if I may, by bringing greetings. The Center for Faith and Inquiry at Gordon College, which is under the direction of my colleague, Professor Tal Howard, is delighted to be able to co-sponsor this panel. Although Professor Howard's unable to join us because he is out of the country, he sends greetings from Gordon College and from the Center and best wishes for the success of this conference. What I decided to do in trying to bring a Protestant perspective is to ask what evangelical Protestants in particular, and perhaps by extension others, could learn from Pope Francis. Early responses to his election saw media hyping a positive response from Protestants. Now, this could come from denominational leaders of liberal-leaning churches eager to interpret the Pope's words on sexuality as evidence for a modernizing perspective that resembled theirs, or stories featuring prominent evangelical or charismatic Protestant leaders in dialogue with Pope Francis, among them Pastor Rick Warren from the Saddleback Church in California, the late Bishop Tony Palmer in the UK, a number of Pentecostals and others. An opinion survey from the Barna Group in March last year put these stories in some kind of perspective. Among any kind of Protestants, at most 45% gave the Pope very favorable or favorable ratings. Among non-mainline, in other words, evangelical Protestants, some Pentecostals and others, that number dropped to 37%. When respondents were asked if Francis's election had altered their view of the Catholic Church, those numbers roughly mirrored the ones I've just given. 70% of Protestants were unmoved. Barna Group President David Kinnaman concluded from this that Protestants remain on the fence about Pope Francis. I should note that some of the individual initiatives that he has taken are most interesting, even if they may give a misleading impression on the response of most Protestants, especially initiatives that have attempted to resolve old disputes. Around the doctrine of salvation, for example, where the Catholic-Lutheran Joint Declaration of 1999 has, it appears, acquired some new traction for addressing those hoary old suspicions about, mutual suspicions about what Catholics and other Christians actually believe. But interesting as those initiatives are in their own right, and as evidence of the willingness of the Francis papacy to reach out to fellow Christians, these won't be my focus in these brief remarks. What I want to focus on instead is the potential for learning from Pope Francis in the area of cultural engagement, with an emphasis, as I've said, on evangelical Protestantism, where I should say I'm an Anglican who underwent as a university student an evangelical conversion. I teach at a college in the evangelical tradition. Protestants' approaches to cultural political engagement vary widely, as I'm sure you know. Anabaptists, for example, confine their engagement to extensive acts of service. But with respect to politics, their perspective is the critical and prophetic one on account of theological convictions about the powers and principalities at work in the world. These tend to confirm Anabaptist separation from the world. Lutherans emphasize the realist tradition of the two kingdoms, Augustine's cities of God and man, and negotiate the relation between the two by appeals to prudence. The Reformed tradition stresses cultural engagement as central to Christian witness, and in a figure like, for example, the Dutchman Abraham Kuyper, articulate a perspective that complements and parallels that of the development of Catholic social teaching since Rerum Novarum in 1891. Evangelical Christians hover between these various perspectives, displaying apolitical, sometimes outright separatist instincts for the most part, punctuated by periodic urgent attempts to recover the culture for Christ or to stem the worst effects of trends of secularization. This gets them into various kinds of hot water, for which James Davison Hunter at the University of Virginia aptly appropriated the term culture wars a couple of decades back. It's that hot water Francis has shown an aptitude for cooling. For his part, Hunter has called for a posture of what he terms faithful presence in response to what he sees as the failed cultural reform strategy of the religious right. But I don't see in Francis the kind of passivity that this term implies as a remedy for social and political initiatives that overreached. Instead, I see the Pope bringing a confident but thoughtful reading of church and culture to bear, coupled with certain, I would call them naturally good instincts for engaging his hearers. Writing back in 2013, I observed that the Pope had managed to propel the full scope of the Church's mission to center stage, and this at a time when that mission was, indeed it remains, vulnerable to capture by a few hot-button issues, so-called. He has acknowledged and challenged a diminished view of the Church as focused exclusively on issues of the culture war. His actions and his words do not simply push those issues into the background, however, and still less do they change doctrine, in my opinion. But they remind Catholics, and by extension other Christians, that there is more to the Christian message than the reiteration of doctrine, however important that doctrine may remain. The body of Christ is called to preach the good news of our hope of Christ, is to preach the good news to the poor, to bring the many faces of care to a hurting world. If I'm seeing this rightly, Pope Francis possesses an ability to change the subject without changing his mind, something evangelicals could learn from, given their high sensitivity to any appearance of backtracking, retreat, surrender in the context of the Christian witness that they're called to. Evangelicals often frame cultural engagement somewhat awkwardly by virtue of, well, one of their virtues. That is, the desire to have people meet Jesus Christ. But this sometimes presents evangelicals with a strategic dilemma to which the Catholic Church may not be prey. Whether this or that act of service helps win people to Christ or may actually draw resources away from that core objective. That is, not service for Christ's sake, but as a strategy, as something that approaches being expedient. The same is true of the culture wars, especially as what evangelicals may see as absolute Christian standards for marriage, family, and religious liberty face the new, growing, countervailing absolutism of the American liberal tradition. Many an evangelical leader has displayed a kind of tunnel vision here, I think. Seeking to stand for the truth, he or she risks shrinking the mission of the Church to one or two commandments, let alone one or two possibly Republican policy commitments. And few of them have found a way to stand firm on these matters and yet, at the same time, still display to the world the grace of God and the invitation to respond to the suffering love of Christ. It's here, as a matter of how to conduct themselves, that Protestants in general, evangelicals in particular, I think, could learn a second lesson from the Pope. This is his essential simplicity, his gentleness in engaging people. In a Boston Globe interview, Cardinal O'Malley put this very well when he observed, I quote, "The word Pope Francis uses over and over again is tenderness. So often he talks about our need to take care of each other, that we have responsibility for each other. In a world that's grown so individualistic and so polarized, his message is the antidote to that," close quote. Examples are legion, and the media have picked up on them. The emphasis conveyed is the Christian life as something to be lived as well as believed, a precious resource for navigating a hurt and dangerous world. Here, evangelical Protestants may not need to de-emphasize their rightful attention to seeking God's guidance, or, as they sometimes say, God's will for my life, notwithstanding the individualistic overtones that can carry. What they may need to do instead is to place alongside that concern that larger sense of being under the grace of God in the messy business that life is. Now, of course, it does not hurt that when Pope Francis speaks in simple terms about having faith and trusting in God, that for outsider observers, those words distance or deinstitutionalize certainly the Catholic Church, let alone the Vatican bureaucracy, or that it makes him appear, perhaps falsely, more accessible than either of his predecessors. One has only to think of how much Christian doctrine is packed into his washing the feet of prisoners, for example. It's also very Franciscan. Preach the gospel and, if necessary, use words. At this point, I'm sure many a Catholic could be muttering, maybe some of you are, yes, please use even fewer words, in response to some of the Pope's off-the-cuff remarks, such as the infamous "who am I to judge" regarding same-sex attraction that was so predictably taken out of context by the secular media. But in anticipation of this sort of objection to Francis as a role model, I would insist that he has by now fully contextualized his off-the-cuff remarks with his steady commitments to preaching the gospel, caring for the poor, upholding the unborn as precious in the sight of God, affirming the centrality of Christian marriage, and so on. On economics, surely, few can take him as a born-again Marxist. And as for yesterday's encyclical on the environment, which I admit I have skimmed, I didn't read carefully just some of it, but I skimmed all of it really very quickly, trying to grasp what it was about. I don't think this will mark him out either as the second coming of Al Gore. Regarding the encyclical, I did want to say that two things, even in my very cursory reading, struck me. First, a simple note was sounded. Obvious, what you'd expect a Christian leader to say, perhaps, that, quote, nothing in this world is indifferent to us, close quote. In other words, everything is a proper object of our care, of our stewardly responsibility as beings made in the image of God. Running through the encyclical is the implied theme of refocusing on what the environment is for. Just as we might ask, what's an economy really for? What's a family for? And so on. The critique of acquisition and consumption follows naturally such a moral refocusing. And the Pope calls us to take action together in line with our moral responsibility as stewards. It also struck me that Pope Francis's appeal for urgent, concerted, and global action rings true because that's how he's framed almost everything he's written. He speaks and writes to Catholics first, of course, but then to Christians more widely and to people of goodwill everywhere. So his framing of climate crisis in these universal terms emanates from an already established sweet spot as a communicator, not from the obligatory formulas of globalization. And last, Protestants might learn something, as we heard a lot more this morning, from the Pope's Latin American background. A somewhat dismissive article from Christianity Today last year declared, "Sorry, Pope Francis, Protestants are converting Catholics across Latin America." And the statistics are fascinating. Latin American Protestants are predominantly converts whose families were Catholic. And yes, their views on core issues are strikingly at odds with their Catholic counterparts. This is nowhere more visible than in views on addressing poverty. When Catholics turn emphatically to charitable work as the remedy, an almost equally strong Protestant response is to bring the poor and needy to Christ. Survey respondents report that Protestant churches in Latin America reached out to them. Now, unquestionably, that means that Catholics who carry much baggage in the region from their sheer historical influence have much to learn about growing churches from their Protestant counterparts. But even so, Pope Francis has negotiated this difficult political, religious, and bureaucratic terrain in his native Argentina, and seems to have done so without resentment towards those who are finding Christ in other churches. Far from it. He reaches out to them and finds common cause where he can. And there's more. Ross Douthat has noticed the importance that attaches to the Latin American setting for better understanding Francis. Where John Paul and Benedict witnessed Marxists sending Catholics to the Gulag, he says, Latin America's Marxists were being murdered by reactionary dictators in a dirty war while a complicit church stood by. What we see here is the importance of steady, faithful adherence to the Church in ways that keep the gospel as the top priority and level criticism at the theological and political hierarchy when events call for it. Only in this way can the good news be free from ideological capture as God's gift to human beings rich and poor. Crisis emerges predictably in all human institutions, however unpredictable each one may be individually. What's vital is to adhere to the mission. So the Francis who takes on the Vatican hierarchy and symbolizes the Church's core location by living in a modest apartment rather than a palace, articulates a critical loyalty that is good for the Church and for the gospel. Protestants, with their sorry history of schism over disagreements large and small, always need help to discern the difference between departing out of obedience to God and succumbing to the temptations of getting control and asking God to bless it. Let me reiterate my appreciation for the wisdom Francis has displayed in resetting priorities that for many Protestants have remained trapped in those of the culture wars. As Peter Wayne put it, contrasting the Pope's approach with Franklin Graham's, that's the son of Billy Graham, quote, Pope Francis understands that Jesus' main mission was to persuade a world in need of God's love and mercy. If the pontiff speaks of the Church primarily as a field hospital, he wrote, Mr. Graham sees it as a sentencing court, close quote. Cultural engagement can be costly, but just because you pay a high price doesn't mean that you chose the right strategy. Ulrich Lehner, writing in First Things, identified 6, I'll call them, axioms of the Francis papacy drawn from the writings of St. Francis de Sales, which sum up for me what evangelical Protestants could do well to emulate. They are: reform is central, simplicity trumps polemics, leaders should be gentle, marriage is a Christian vocation, engagement with media is useful, and last, one must keep a sense of mission, without which the church will die. Now, evangelicals, to be sure, do not fail on all of these, but it is important that they keep all of them together in a lively tension. Thank you. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes, so we'll take a few questions at this point. Yes, and if you could wait until the microphone gets to you, so if the microphone could get there quickly.
Who raised their hand?
Thank you, gentlemen. That was illuminating, for sure. I liked what Rabbi Franklin, you said about the importance of Francis's pilgrimage to Theodor Herzl's grave. And as I'm sure you know, one of the central questions for Herzl in the Jewish state was Palestine or Argentine, which I think is particularly apropos.
Uganda.
I'm sorry?
Uganda.
Uganda was also on the list, yeah. And so I was curious as to how important Francis believes that this particular physical land is to the Jewish people, particularly Jerusalem, right? And Professor Azizi talked about the sacralization of politics. The State Department of the United States still says Tel Aviv is actually the capital, not Jerusalem. So I guess some perspective on how Francis feels about this particular piece of land and the relationship that the Jewish people have with it is what I'm asking about.
I can't tell any more than what I said already, but it seems to me that he quite well understands that Jews have an ancestral background, history, heritage, and, if you will, claim to that land. The Torah was written there, the prophets walked there and taught there. The movement that Jesus was part of lived there. That's without historical contention. And so I think he understands that is a very Jewish place, and rightfully so. I think what he's trying to do by interjecting himself into politics is to offer himself as an honest broker, if you will, to being able to acknowledge that the Palestinians have rights and needs, and I think right-thinking Jews also have such notions. I think the situation is very complicated, very complex. It's grown perhaps worse over the years, which is unfortunate for everybody. But I think that his moderating voice and his ability to speak to both sides, his desire to speak to both sides with respect and not condemnation is very important, and hopefully he can have some influence here. Our American government has tried, as you know, with not too much success recently. I was just talking to an Israeli friend yesterday, a man who made Aliyah from America, from Rhode Island, actually. And he talked about how he and other Israelis have moved from left to center, and others have moved from center to right, because they don't see response from the other side, which is unfortunate. My hope is that Pope Francis can help enlighten both sides to the merits and wisdom of coming together and reaching some kind of resolution that will give everybody a place of honor and respect and an ability to live comfortably with each other. Yes?
Comments to the year 2000, I was in Iran on a family visit. I walked along the street, and a public bus crossed past me, and on the back of the bus was a huge sign which said, "Remember God." And I've thought about this a great deal, and I wonder if in your opinion, one of the basic problems between Islam and the West is the Islamic world believes that the West has given up on the worship of the divine sovereignty.
You know, I'm really always very hesitant to generalize. As you well know, there are so many different shades of opinion and faith commitment in the Islamic world that for some what you said could be entirely true, but quite frankly I don't see that as the general attitude that would characterize Muslims.
We have time for one more question.
Rabbi Franklin, I wonder to what we can attribute this very welcome change in attitude of the Catholic Church toward Jews. You mentioned the changes in viewpoint promoted by Pope John Paul II, by his successor, and now by Pope Francis. But I have to believe that it runs a lot deeper than that. I wonder if you could speak to maybe some deeper or the deepest sources of these changes in attitudes towards Jews. That it's not just individual popes.
Yeah. See if this stands up. I think a lot of it has to do with the Church's awakening after the Holocaust and being shocked at what had happened in, shall we say, dare we say, Christian Europe. I'm not suggesting that Christianity is directly at fault with what happened in the Holocaust. The Nazis were anti-Christian as they were anti-Jewish. And yet they played heavily on the anti-Semitism of Christianity, both Protestant and Catholicism, in Europe, which was cultivated over more than 1,000 years. And I think it brought a lot of people up short, and they began to re-look at what was going on with their theology and their rejection of Jews, and people began to rethink positions that they had held for a long time. I heard a lecture at Providence College 2 or 3 months ago by a professor from Berkeley. His name is John Connolly, and he wrote a book From Enemy to Brother. I suggest you may want to look at that, and because he traces this quite clearly. I can't quote him for you, but I've been reading the book, and I find it very moving, and that may be helpful for you in seeing this transition of ideology. You had some people, including some people who were Jewish converts to Catholicism in Germany and Austria, who spoke rather hostilely of Judaism, theologically, even while condemning Hitler's racism, and they didn't realize that they were talking out of two sides of their mouth, and that one really had to do with the other. In time, these people changed their points of view, and some of them, like Monsignor John Österreicher, came to be one of the authors of Nostra Aetate. So there was transition, certainly before these popes, but I recommend the book From Enemy to Brother to you highly.
Well, thank you all very much. And, thanks.